Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson. I'm out here listening to America, and I'm in one of the most important places on the entire Lewis and Clark Trail. This is the mouth of the Bad or Teton River here at Pierre and Fort Pierre, South Dakota. Lewis and Clark came through in the last days of September 1804. They had an encounter with Lakota here that was tense. They spent 4 days. There were 2 moments where this could easily have descended into bloodshed, even a bloodbath. And it's not clear how that would have come out. The Lakota owned this river, at least this main stretch. The Lakota regarded themselves as the sovereign here. This was their river, and they could open it or close it at will. Of course, the United States knew something about that because France and Spain had been closing the Mississippi at will for a number of decades. That's what led to the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And the Lakota said, you just can't waltz through here. You either leave some of your goods with us, and they weren't sure what this mission was, a trading mission, a military mission, an invasion. They didn't like it. So you can leave a third of what you have here, you could turn back, but you can't go on without paying the tariff, without paying tribute for the privilege of being able to pass through our sovereign territory. They had every right to make this argument. Of course, fell on deaf ears with Lewis and Clark, who assumed that they represented, the American Republic and that no natives were going to get in the way of their mission. Jefferson had made a particular point to Lewis to have special regard for the Sioux, as they were then called, and to bend over backwards to accommodate them and to conciliate them. Twice in those 4 days, things nearly came to bloodshed, even bloodbath. In the end, it was Black Buffalo, the leader of the Lakota, who, in a sense, resolved the issue by making it clear that Lewis and Clark would be allowed to go on, but they must give something as a token of Lakota sovereignty. And in the end, it wound up being just a bit of tobacco, or a twist of tobacco. But at least that was enough for the acknowledgement that nobody goes through Lakota territory without at least that small token was an acknowledgement that this was Lakota territory and they could turn this river open or shut like a faucet anytime they needed to. It's important for us to remember this was a huge, expansive growth period for the Lakota. They were an empire. They had heard about these bearded white people from the east, but they weren't particularly at issue at this point. Here's the thing I want to say about this. This is how historiography changes, how we mature, how we learn to see things not from a single lens, but through a series of lenses. It was the greatest Lewis and Clark scholar, in my opinion, James Rhonda, who first wrote Lewis and Clark Among the Indians in 1984, and that book was revolutionary because for the first time, someone says, hey, what if you turn the lens and look at this expedition, if to the extent that it's possible, from an indigenous, from a native point of view? That threw open the doors to a much more nuanced, thoughtful, inclusive, diverse, and just understanding of what happened on this 2.5-year journey. And Rhonda gave a lecture, which I regard as one of the most important lectures in the history of the last 25 or 30 years on Lewis and Clark, in which he said, look, the Lakota had every right to do what they did. Lewis and Clark overreacted. They were all huff and puff. How dare you? Clark raises his sword and says, we are not squaws, but men. We have enough medicine in those boats to kill, X number of tribes like yours. All that kind of American huff and puff. And the Lakota were either rolling their eyes or offended by all of this. But this leader, Black Buffalo, steps forward. He's the one that found the path to a peaceful settlement to this dispute. Until James Rhonda gave that lecture, which was percolated into the Lewis and Clark world, we had a very Eurocentric, monochromatic view of all this. Like Lewis and Clark were righteous and they were innocent and they were just doing what they were entitled to do. And here were these natives who didn't understand the Enlightenment and were selfishly trying to control the river and so on. That was such a weak paradigm. And once Rhonda was able to shatter it, not alone, there was a lot of native input here. Rhonda was listening to indigenous people who care about this story. Once that happened, it changed everything. And now that Rhonda moment in which we looked at this confrontation with fresh eyes for the first time in 100 years began to play itself out across all of the other encounters of the Lewis and Clark expedition. We're so fortunate to be able to see in this new way. I don't blame the people who saw it through a Eurocentric lens. We're all creatures of our time. But the cultural revolution that occurred in the United States beginning in the 1960s and is not over yet, but has really hit a wall here. But after enormous achievements in African American studies, Chicano studies, women's studies, LGBTQ studies, you name it, there's been just an enormous broadening of the way we see the history of this country. And it's so much better now, more complicated, less tidy, sometimes frustrating, less easy to describe in a sentence or two, harder to put on a monument. But we are infinitely better off having this new paradigm. And although the Lakota, the Sioux, played a significant role in all of that, it was James Rhonda who really made this happen. And we all owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. His insights, there are about, I'd say, 20 key Rhonda insights. Not all about encounters with natives, but about 20 key James Rhonda insights about this expedition that are now essential foundation to anybody who wants to try to understand it. Now, if you look at the sign, I will quibble just a little with it. Near the spot 23 to 28, right? Historic first meeting? Well, not quite. They had met with the Yankton Sioux down by the mouth of the James River near Sioux City, so that's a little off. The commission captains Clark and so on, we make peaceful contact. The Bad River was named by Clark because he was in a bad mood after this set of confrontations. But it wasn't all bad. There were dances, there were feasts. The Lewis and Clark were offered dog as a ceremonial and sacred delicacy. They got to witness some native dancing, including what appears to be a war dance or a scalp dance. They got a sense of the complexity of the Lakota world and the power of the Lakota and the dignity and majesty and beauty of many of their ways. The captains were offered native women. The other men of the expedition probably took advantage of these offers too. This is not really about sex. It's about embedding oneself with these strangers and trying to figure them out, maybe wind up with a piece of metal or some cloth or some beads or who knows what, a knife, a kettle, an awl, a saw, a magnifying glass, a mirror, who knows. But this is that spot. And today it's a marina and there's a wedding going on. We do this kind of a cowboy South Dakota wedding. It's all marvelous. It's a beautiful day to be in South Dakota on the Lewis and Clark Trail. And just one more thing, out there, the barge, the keelboat, was anchored at about 70 yards off the mouth of the river here, the Teton or Bad River. And there was a confusion on one of the sort of taxiing services of the pirogues back and forth to carry men and carry the captains and make sure everything was secure. And the pirogue clipped the rope that was holding the anchor. The anchor fell to the bottom of the Missouri River. The barge started to drift. There was kind of shouting. Everyone came rushing down. It looked like there might be a confrontation, maybe some act of hostility had occurred. Everybody soon calmed down. The next day, the expedition looked for that anchor. It has never been found. Now, an anchor does not wind up in the Gulf of Mexico. An anchor does not wind up in Iowa. That anchor is here. It's probably buried under 1 gazillion tons of silt and sand. But that anchor, presumably, is still here. So far as we're told, it has never been discovered. Now, it might have been found at some point by some private entity and hidden away, but I think we would know about it if it had ever been recovered. Then they had to make a kind of makeshift anchor after that and so on. This was, of all the 50-some encounters that the expedition had with indigenous people, this was one of the two most important in terms of potential loss. This one ended peacefully. Nobody hurt. Came close twice, not once but twice. Then there was the incident with the Piegan Blackfeet up in northwestern Montana on the return journey with Lewis and just 3 of his men, in which they wound up killing 2 young men who were trying to steal the horses and the rifles of that small contingent of the expedition. Most of the encounters Lewis and Clark had with natives were highly successful. It's not that natives necessarily accepted what Lewis and Clark had to say. There was a lot of huff and puff, but they took it under advisement. They were generous on the whole, tolerant, hospitable, helped Lewis and Clark along. Of course, wanted things that were in those boats and got some of it. But the insight, what the native people had to realize, and it was a hard diplomatic sell, is that this was not a trade mission. And yet they had a smattering of what would become trade goods, and they wanted to give them to native peoples as a way of saying, if you cooperate with the intentions of the United States government, trading vessels will come here, will supply you with your needs, whether it's kettles or knives or hatchets or beads or whatever it is you might wish. We can supply that more reliably and less expensively than the British traders who come here from time to time. But you have to cooperate. You have to put aside war with other natives. You have to put aside war and skirmishing with other native peoples. And you have to be generous and helpful to any Americans who come this way. That was the bargain. And it's very interesting because most of the natives, they listened and they answered to a degree and asked for more, puzzled about who these people were, what their purposes were. And of course, when Lewis and Clark said the old white people who controlled this world are gone and the new white people are here, old white people, the new white people look essentially the same. Native peoples had a hard time figuring out, what exactly are they trying to tell us here. The linguistic channels were often very confused. And in fact, on this one of the problems was that Lewis and Clark did not have an adequate translator. Pierre Cruzat knew sign language. That helped a little. There were several of the Frenchmen who could speak a little Sioux, a little Lakota. But they had made a fundamental mistake. They had brought Pierre Dorion back upriver from way down below the Platte for the specific purpose of being a translator and a diplomat amongst the Sioux people. But he did not come this far. He stopped at the Yankton Sioux, which is where he had his facility. So when they got here, they did not have an adequate linguist, not even an adequate amateur linguist. And so it says here that language difficulties led to an armed confrontation. I wouldn't say that's what happened. I'd say that James Rhonda got it right. But the Lakota regarded this as their sovereign nation. So today, the people of the United States regard this as their sovereign nation. Now we have overlapping sovereignty, but it leads to a lot of chaos. But Lewis and Clark were trespassing from that point. And they came with kind of a haughtiness, and the Lakota didn't like it, and they made that clear, and Lewis and Clark had no capacity to think, I suppose they have a point. We are sort of showing up unannounced and uninvited, and we're telling them all sorts of geopolitical things that occurred in Paris and Washington, D.C. that they have no capacity to know yet. At no point did Lewis and Clark think, You know, yeah, it is their lands. We better be really conciliatory here, and we better acknowledge that, because they could have said, we'll do that now because time is on our side. There are millions of us and just a handful of them. In the long run, demographics and westward expansion will take care of it, and their need for trade goods that they can't produce themselves. They have no metallurgy for it yet. But that's not what they did. Instead, they stiffened and got their back up and made a big stink out of it and came that close to a bloodbath. And I see justice on both sides. There's no absolute right and wrong in this story. But we can't go on as a people now unless we understand complexities that have been difficult for white people to accept because we've been in this conquest mode since 1607. And even though the Indian wars, fought with guns and bows and arrows and so on, ended in 1890, more or less, the Indian wars in a metaphoric sense go on and on and on. It's not over yet. And to this day, the Lakota will say that under the 1868 treaty, they own all of western South Dakota and much more, including to Black Hills. They never yielded this land to the white people. The white people just took it in the aftermath of the Little Bighorn. That it's still Lakota land, and that justice is on their side, and the time will come when the white world has to acknowledge that and produce reparations, land restoration, land back, etc. And that the idea that there's nothing to answer for here, that the winners took all, and that's how geopolitical dynamics work. That paradigm is over, and we have to come to a more enlightened view of all of this. And I say, absolutely, nobody loses, everybody wins from this. There has to be healing, there has to be reconciliation, there has to be an acknowledgement of wrongs done. And yes, we are complicit. I'm complicit. We're all complicit because I live on lands in North Dakota that were appropriated from the Mandan. And they were never asked if that's something that they wanted to have happen. In fact, I live within a few miles of one of their most principal villages on the east bank of the Missouri River, in Bismarck, Mandan, where the Heart River comes into the Missouri. Once had 13 and maybe more Mandan villages. It was the heart of the Mandan world. And now I own a house in Fee Simple, about 2 miles from the Missouri River, on what is certainly historically Mandan land for a lot longer than it has been American land. It's worth thinking about these things, and it doesn't do us any harm to be candid, generous, open-minded, thoughtful, willing to learn, humble in the face of a complexity that's way beyond anything that is in most of the history books we encountered when we were young people or children. So this place truly matters.